Yeah, I don't speak any Czech at all, sorry. So, my name's Mark. I'm a rhythmic movement training instructor and a brain gym instructor.
Jsem instruktor rhythmic movement training a brain gym instruktor.
This is the first time I've ever done anything like this, talking with a translator.
Takže je to poprvé, kdy přednáší s tlumočníkem.
So far good, so good.
Zatím to tedy asi jde. Jdeme dál.
How many of you are parents?
Kolik z vás je rodičů?
Hands. Okay. And how many of you are therapists and professionals that work with children in various forms, from teachers to therapists?
Kolik z vás je terapeutů nebo profesionálů v oblasti práce s dětmi?
Yeah, a good number. Good. Okay. Right. So, what I'm going to do is, Gabriella has very kindly and very patiently and worked very hard to translate my PowerPoint into Czech. So what I'm going to do is ask her to translate it, read it from the slide, which is easy to do, and then I'm going to add bits to the slides where it's necessary.
Takže rád bych pracoval tak, že na obrazovce se vždycky objeví český překlad té prezentace a já jako tlumočník vám to přečtu a potom budu tlumočit to, co k tomu chce Mark dodat.
Okay. You can ask questions as we go along, so if there's a slide that comes up, please feel free to put your hand up so that you can ask and it can be translated.
Během přednášky se můžete ptát, můžete pokládat otázky. Já vás jenom z organizačních důvodů požádám, abyste je buď řekli česky, pokud je chcete říct anglicky, můžete, ale přeložte je prosím vás do češtiny, aby všichni věděli, na co se ptáme.
Okay. I've been working with movement, brain gym and rhythmic movement training for 16 years in the UK.
Takže v oblasti rhythmic movement training a brain gym pracuji už 16 let ve Velké Británii.
And I've seen profound changes in the people that I work with, from young children to adults to sports people, purely through using developmental movements.
Takže díky těmto vývojovým pohybům jsem viděl hluboké změny jak u dětí, tak u dospělých i u profesionálních sportovců.
I've also experienced huge change, profound change in myself when I went on a brain gym course back in 2003.
Zaznamenal jsem velkou změnu i u sebe, když jsem když jsem šel na kurz Brain Gym v roce 2003.
At the beginning of the course, no way could I stand up and do what I'm doing now.
Na začátku kurzu bych nebyl schopen se takhle postavit a dělat to, co dělám teď.
When I was 11 years old, I had a school play where I had a part to play, obviously, and when it came to the performance, I shut down.
Když mi bylo 11 let, hrál jsem ve školním představení a když jsem měl zahrát svou roli, tak jsem úplně zkamenil.
From doing the brain gym and the rhythmic movement training program, and understanding how the brain develops and what happens to brain under stress, I understand now why I shut down.
Díky tomu, že jsem dělal brain gym a rhythmic movement training, tak jsem zjistil, jak mozek funguje a proč jsem se v té době vlastně vypnul.
So working with children that are under stress, that the brain, the areas of the brain are not well connected, that's what happens to them.
Takže toto se stává dětem, které jsou ve stresu a jejichž oblasti mozku nejsou správně zapojeny.
So brain gym provides movements, rhythmic movement training provide developmental movements that help to instantly make a change in the brain function and sensory function.
Rhythmic movement training poskytuje jakési vývojové pohyby, které napomáhají mozku, aby se správně zapojil a správně fungoval.
So what I'm going to do in this presentation is to share with you how the brain develops, the sensory motor system develops using movement. Okay, so.
Já tady přečtu, co všichni vidíte na tabuli, oblasti, o kterých budu mluvit. Typické symptomy přetrvávajících reflexů, které je možné vidět na školách, proč máte mnoho dětí problém s učením. Jste mozek a smysly během prvních let života. Co to jsou kojenecké, primární a posteriorní? Proč jsou reflexy důležité pro vývoj mozku a smyslu? Jak se vyvíjejí lidské smysly? Jak může pohyb pomoci? Jak mohou být napraveny fyzické chování ve společenské a akademické oblasti? A také vám předvedu ukázku za pomoci pohybu, který se vztahuje k nějaké oblasti mozku a určité úrovni změny. Že to je obsah dnešní přednášky.
Sounds good. Also do is allow time at the end to demonstrate an area of the brain and the difficulties that it can relate to, and then show you some movements that will make a change instantly. There will be a level of change instantly.
Takže na konci si chci nechat nějaký čas pro to, aby mluvilo o jisté oblasti mozku, kde mohou vznikat problémy, a potom vám ukázat cvičení, kde uvidíte okamžité změny.
These are typical signs that you would see in a classroom. Classrooms. There are two slides here. There are many more, but these are typical signs that most classrooms see with children with learning difficulties. Do you recognize some of these? Mm-hmm. You see them in your classroom? Yes. Probably in yourself, maybe too. You got what? Have you read? Okay. Next one. Pardon?
Should I read it? Or should I read it?
No, don't need to. Yeah, that's fine. So these are a few more signs and symptoms that you see in the classroom. And these all relate to areas of the brain that are not sufficiently connected. And by making developmental movements and working with reflexes, which I will talk about, these symptoms and signs that you would see disappear. If the brain doesn't get the developmental connections, areas of the brain are not properly and sufficiently connected, some people find ways of compensating.
Pokud oblasti mozku nejsou správně zapojeny, tak jak to má být v správném vývoji, tak spousta lidí si najde kompenzace k tomu, jak tyto oblasti spojit.
They have to work harder at what they want to achieve.
Musí pracovat velmi těžce na tom, když chcou něčeho dosáhnout.
And then there are some that don't have that ability. They're not even at that level, that those are the ones that then fail the system.
A jsou zde i lidé, kteří nemají schopnost této kompenzace a potom dochází k selhání.
And that doesn't need to happen.
A to by se nemuselo stávat.
And I'll explain why.
A vysvětlím vám proč.
This is a typical thing that one would see when things are too difficult. It's stressful, the person gets tired.
To je typická reakce, kterou vidíte, když je něco příliš těžké.
And the I can't becomes I can. Once the brain is better connected through making the movements that we can do, whether we're adults or children, the I can't becomes I can.
Když se mozek zapojí prostřednictvím práce dětí nebo u dospělých, tak se najednou z nemůžu stane můžu.
Dr. Paul MacLean, back in the 1970s, researched and studied the brain, wanted to see how the brain functions, what the structure was like. And found that there were three evolutionary stages. One is the reptilian brain,
První je takzvaný plazí mozek.
and this is the area of the brain that is most developed, not fully developed, but it's the most developed area at birth.
A tato oblast je při narození z velké většiny vyvinutá.
And this develops between, in utero, it starts in utero at around 5 weeks and develops and should be fully developed by about 15 months.
Takže začne se vyvíjet 5 týdnů po početí v děloze a mělo by se plně vyvinout do 15 měsíců po narození.
The next area of the brain that develops is the cerebellum.
Další oblast mozku, která se vyvíjí, je mozeček.
And this should develop between 6 and 12 months after birth.
Tady by se měl plně vyvinout mezi 6 až 12 měsíci po narození.
And I'm going to explain what each of the areas relate to. Some of you will already know, I'm sure.
Vysvětlím, k čemu se každá z těchto oblastí mozku vztahuje.
But this is known as the little brain.
Mozeček je známý jako malý mozek.
And it's a very important part of the brain to develop between the 6 and the 12 months. We need to get it right.
A je to velmi důležitá část mozku, která se má mezi 6. a 12. měsícem vyvinout. Potřebujeme, aby se vyvinula správně.
The next area of the brain that develops from about 15 months to 4 years is the mammalian brain, or known as the limbic system.
Další oblast mozku, která se vyvíjí od 15 měsíců až do 4 let po narození, je limbický systém, takzvaný savčí mozek.
And then the cortex, the right side of the brain, develops between 4.
Mozková kůra, pravá hemisféra se vyvíjí mezi 4 a 7 lety.
And then the left brain develops from about 8 onwards.
A levá mozková hemisféra se vyvíjí od 8 let dál.
And then the newest part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex,
A nejnovější kůra
between 9 and 25. It's the longest period of time for its growth and the connections to be made.
se vyvíjí mezi 9 až 25 lety. Potřebuje nejdelší čas pro vyvinutí.
Made the brain allowed to be stimulated, connection to the cortex between 6 and 12 months.
Ale počáteční spojení vznikají už mezi 6. až 12. měsícem, kdy se vyvíjí právě mozeček. Proto je velmi důležité, aby byl mozeček vyvinut správně a tato počáteční spojení do prefrontální kůry.
There are a lot of the difficulties that can come, and some of the issues are through ADHD, behavioral problems, sudden outbursts that children get.
Tady právě vznikají ty problémy, jako je například ADHD,
behavioral problems,
problémy s chováním
lack of emotion,
a nedostatek emoční kontroly.
because this area of the brain, initial contact, connections, time.
Ta prefrontální náspojení s tím mozečkem právě v tom období do 12 měsíců.
Okay, next. So these are the areas of the brain and their four. So going back to the beginning where the brain first starts, this is to do with survival.
Toto jsou oblasti mozku a také informace o tom, za co jsou tyto oblasti mozku zodpovědné. A ten plazí mozek, ta nejnižší úroveň, je zodpovědná za přežití.
So if somebody is living constantly in survival, and that's adults, teenagers, young children, adults as well, this is because this area of the brain hasn't had its full development.
Takže když někdo žije v takovém konstantním stavu, dá se říct přežití, ať když to jsou děti, teenageři nebo dospělí, je to proto, že tato oblast mozku není plně rozvinutá.
Children that don't feel connected to the world and to the people around,
Děti, které se necítí spojeny se světem a s lidmi kolem sebe,
then this area of the brain isn't sufficiently developed. Then we've got the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is to do with when a baby is born, the movements are very jerky, stiff, uncoordinated.
Když se dítě narodí, pohyby jsou velmi trhané, stuhlé, nekoordinované.
And the cerebellum's role is to make the movement smooth and rhythmical and controlled.
A mozeček je odpovědný za to, aby byl pohyb plynulý, rytmický a kontrolovaný.
So if a baby and a young infant doesn't get the opportunity to make the movements that work the cerebellum,
A pokud dítě, malé dítě, nedostane dostatek příležitostí, aby rozvíjel mozeček,
and the baby gets up onto 2 feet,
a poté se dostane na 2 nohy, do stoje,
then whatever is undeveloped while they were on the floor, before they rise up onto 2 feet, can remain at that lower level of development.
poté to, co se nevyvinulo v době, kdy bylo na podlaze, kdy bylo na těch nižších úrovních, zůstane nedostatečně vyvinutý.
Limbic system that develops how we feel.
Poté máme limbický systém, který se vyvíjí mezi 5 měsíci až 4 let, 15 měsíců až 4 lety, pardon. A ten je zodpovědný za to, jak se cítíme, ten je zodpovědný s emocemi.
How we express ourselves, so going through the terrible twos,
A jak se vyjadřujeme, takže jak procházíme i přes období vzdoru,
is a really important stage for development. It's a period of time when the baby needs, the youngster needs to be able to express themselves.
což je velice důležité období pro vývoj. A v tomto období dítě potřebuje projevit samo sebe, vyjádřit se.
So children that don't go through the terrible two stage and become defiant, angry, they're not able to express themselves, they're the children that when they, as they get older, they're the walkovers. They'll do whatever they're told to do.
Takže dítě, které si neprojde obdobím vzdoru, steku a tak dále, takovým dítětem, které dělá všechno, co se mu řekne. Velmi.
Confidence to be able to speak up for themselves.
A nemají sebevědomí pro to, aby se za sebe mohli postavit.
Also known in English terms as people pleasers.
A lidé, kteří se anglicky řeknou pleasers,
Part of the brain important to help the child, help the infant to develop.
Takže tato část mozku je velmi důležitá, abychom pomohli dítěti rozvíjet.
And I'll explain why each of these areas don't develop as well as they could as we go through the presentation.
Vám vysvětlím, proč se některé oblasti nerozvíjí tak, jak by se mohly rozvinout.
We've got the cortex, the right side of the brain that develops between 4 and 7. That's our creative brain, imaginative, spontaneous brain.
Zde máme mozkovou fůru, kdy pravá hemisféra se rozvíjí mezi 4 až 7 lety a je zodpovědná za kreativitu, představivost.
So we need lots of play, lots of being read to.
Takže potřebujeme hodně hraní, potřebujeme, aby se nám hodně četlo,
Lots of spontaneous imagination.
hodně spontánní představivosti.
And if the child doesn't get that opportunity to do that, then the right brain doesn't get the full development that it needs before the left brain then comes in.
Pokud dítě nemá příležitosti k tomu, aby se rozvinula tato pravá část mozku, je plně nerozvinutá, než se začne rozvíjet levá hemisféra.
So if we expect children at a too earlier age to be able to sit still and do formal learning,
Takže když očekáváme u dětí,
being able to sit at chairs, being able to sit and listen to the teacher,
když očekáváme u malých dětí, aby byly schopné se učit, aby byly schopné sedět v klidu,
then it's going to leave a deficiency to the right brain.
tak to nechá nějaké následky právě na té pravé hemisféře.
This area of speech, thinking, imagination, creativity. So we need lots of play to start with between 4 and 7.
Takže tato vlastnost, jak jsme si řekli, je odpovědná za řeč, myšlení, představivost a kreativitu. Proto potřebujeme mezi 4 a 7 lety hry.
And then more formal learning at the age of 7, 8 onwards.
A poté formálnější učení od věku 7, 8 let dál.
But that's not the way the schools work. Not your fault. Cortex at the front here, executive officer, CEO.
Poté máme prefrontální kůru, které se může říkat generální ředitelství, angličtině.
That, as you can see, has all these responsibilities. It's everything that happens, everything that we feel has to come up through the nervous system, through the different areas of the brain to the prefrontal cortex.
Všechno, co se stane, všechno, co cítíme, se dostane přes různé oblasti mozku do té prefrontální kůry, která je zodpovědná za ty oblasti, které vidíte na slajdu.
And then the cortex decides what to do, how to deal with that information and give appropriate responses.
A poté prefrontální kortex rozhodne o tom, jak na danou situaci reagovat nebo co dělat a je zodpovědný vlastně za odpověď.
So you can see that if this area of the brain doesn't get sufficient connections to it, then the lower levels of the brain can't get that information up for that part of the brain to deal with.
Takže jak můžete vidět, pokud zde není dostatečně prefrontální, ty nižší oblasti mozku nemohou tam vyslat tu informaci, která by tam měla vyslat.
So from attention, comprehension, focus, forward planning, control of impulses.
Takže jak vidíte, tak uvažování, porozumění, kontrola impulzů, soustředění.
Area of the brain.
Všechno vychází z této oblasti mozku.
That the cerebellum connections sufficiently between neurons.
Mozeček je zodpovědný za to učinit tato spojení efektivními mezi čistými.
How many people here deal with behavioral issues, sudden outbursts, ADHD, behavioral issues?
Kolik lidí tady má problém, nebo řeší problém s ADHD a problém s chováním?
Okay.
Children, I guess.
Pardon?
And they children.
Are they children? Yes.
And they children. That's what I asked.
All these little signs and symptoms and difficulties that children have can be changed by using movement.
Všechny tyto problémy a potíže, které děti mají, mohou být právě změněny díky těm rytmickým pohybům.
So what I'm going to do at the end is to demonstrate for somebody who coming up and demonstrating working with the cerebellum to make the front brain.
Na konci bych na nějakém dobrovolném povídat ukázal nějaké pohyby, které jsou zodpovědné za právě rozvoj mozečku a ukázat, jak ta spojení, jak ty cviky mohou fungovat na zapojení.
So don't be afraid, it's an opportunity to develop yourself if you need it.
Takže se nebojte, je to příležitost pro vás, abyste se mohli.
So to be able to be made from the senses, from the central nervous system, up through into the cerebellum, and to be able to connect these areas of the brain so that we can access what each of those areas are responsible for.
Takže musí být vytvořena spojení, která propojí všechny tady ty oblasti mozku, abychom měli přístup ke všem těmto oblastem a ke všem, za co jsou tyto oblasti zodpovědné.
The cerebellum, this area here, is responsible for making the initial neurological connections through the two speech.
Mozeček je zodpovědný za vytvoření počátečních spojení s řečovými centry mozku.
So children that are delayed speech, late to talk, behind in their speech, then the cerebellum probably hasn't had the development that it needed.
Děti, které mají problémy s opožděnou řečí, mluví později, ale zřejmě nemají vytvořená dostatečná spojení právě z mozečku, z řečovými centry, z toho mozečku.
So the movements that I'm going to show you later on actually work the cerebellum, and if those are used on a regular basis, it'll stimulate the cerebellum, which will then connect the speech centers, and speech comes on very quickly.
Pohyby, které vám ukáží na konci, rozvíjí právě mozeček, a když se tyto pohyby právě s těmito řečovými centry.
The better the brain is connected, the more the connections are made, the more resources we have to be able to learn and to be able to function in life.
Jak vidíte, tak oč více máme spojení a jsou tato spojení silnější, o to více máme zdrojů pro učení a pro fungování v životě.
Neural development. The most growth period of neurological connections is in the first year of life.
Takže největší rozvoj těch nervových spojů je v prvním roce života.
We're born with the brain cells, so they say there's 100 billion brain cells throughout the brain.
Rodíme se se stovkami miliard mozkových buněk.
But what we haven't got are the connections.
Ale co nemáme, to jsou spojení.
And this is where movement is so important during the first year of life particularly.
A zde je právě velmi důležitý pohyb, zejména během prvního roku.
And by allowing the reflexes, the primitive and postural reflexes, to develop and play their role in making further connections.
A další důležitou roli mají primární reflexy, které také vytvářejí.
Reflexes, and why should I care?
Co to jsou primární reflexy a proč by mě měly zajímat?
How many people have heard of primitive and postural reflexes?
Kolik z vás slyšelo o primárních posturálních reflexech?
Okay. Do you understand the role of the reflexes, or you've just heard the name?
Rozumíte roli primárních reflexů, nebo jste jenom slyšeli ten název?
Do you work with them?
Pracujete s nimi?
Mm-hmm. You recognize signs and symptoms of the reflexes?
A umíte poznat znaky a symptomy těch reflexů?
Yeah, some do, some don't. Yeah. The reflexes, the primitive reflexes, are the foundations to the central nervous system.
Primární reflexy jsou základy pro centrální nervový systém.
So they are really important to be aware of, and it's movement that develops the primitive reflexes and the postural reflexes.
Takže je velmi důležité vědět o těchto primárních reflexech a také o pohybech, které je provázejí nebo rozvíjí.
As the baby learns to move, the inborn program of reflexes starts to develop the neural connections.
Tak jak se dítě učí pohybovat, tak se začíná zapojovat ten systém, který je nastaven právě těmi primárními reflexy.
It stimulates the senses,
Stimuluje smysly
and the senses then make the connections.
a smysly poté vytváří spojení.
So if a baby doesn't get the opportunity to move,
Pokud dítě nemá příležitost k tomu, aby se hýbalo,
then the senses don't get the development they need.
a poté se smysly nevyvinou tak, jak by potřebovali.
The reflexes don't get the stimulation they need,
A reflexy nedostanou potřebnou stimulaci
and then they can be retained for life.
a mohou přetrvat po celý život.
Retained means they're still active in the system rather than having played their role fully and become inhibited, quietened down in the system. We no longer need them.
Přetrvávání znamená, že ještě stále jsou v systému aktivní a že nesplnili ještě svou roli pouze toho, že jsou jakýmsi základem pro naše fungování.
So children with learning difficulties will have primitive and postural reflexes still retained in the system.
Takže děti s problémy s učením a s chováním budou mít stále přetrvávat primární reflexy.
And when you've studied the reflexes and understand the signs and symptoms of each of the reflexes,
A když studujete reflexy
you can recognize why the child or the adult, this is adults as well, we can retain them ourselves.
Můžete poznat, proč děti, anebo také dospělí, protože i dospělí mohou mít samozřejmě přetrvávající primární reflexy.
It will show why they have the difficulties they have.
Ukáže se, proč mají ty problémy, které mají.
And by pushing the child more and more,
A tím, že budete na dítě tlačit stále více,
actually creates more stress to the system.
vlastně vytvoříte více stresu pro systém.
Really, the best way would be to find which reflexes are still active.
A nejlepším způsobem by bylo přijít na to, které reflexy jsou stále aktivní.
And then use movement, developmental movements, to work the specific reflexes.
A poté použít vývojové pohyby pro práci s každým reflexem.
And then the learning difficulties will disappear.
A poté se potíže s učením, poté potíže s učením.
Every one of us are born with.
Takže reflexe má každý z nás. Máme narození s reflexem.
To have played their role in the first 12 months after birth, during and up to the first 12 months after birth.
Primární reflexe musí splnit svou roli v prvních 12 měsících po narození, během vývoje epidioze a během prvních 12 měsíců po narození.
You're doing good. And if once the baby gets up, the infant gets up onto 2 feet, whatever reflexes are still undeveloped, unintegrated at that time, can remain that way.
Když se dítě postaví na nohy, reflexy, které stále byly neintegrované v té době, tak zůstávají integrované, přetrvávají dál.
So the rhythmic movement training program goes back to working on the floor,
Takže program Movement Training se vrací k práci na podlaze
and gets them to do the movements that they may have missed for whatever reason, and I'm going to explain why.
a nechává děti provádět pohyby, které zřejmě neprováděly, které vynechali z důvodu, které vám řeknu posléze.
And usually they can't do these simple movements that should have been able to have learnt to have done in the first 12 months.
A oni obvykle neumí dělat tyto pohyby, které se měly naučit právě během prvních 12 měsíců po narození.
And when they can't do the movements, it shows that the reflexes are still active and the areas of the brain are not sufficiently connected.
A když pohyby neumí dělat, znamená to, že reflexy jsou stále ještě aktivní a že oblasti mozku ještě nejsou správně zapojeny.
And then as they learn to make the movements exact and rhythmical and smooth and effortless, then the brain becomes better connected. We have the resources to be able to learn, and learning difficulties are no longer a problem.
A jak se naučí vykonávat tyto pohyby plynule, bez námahy, rytmicky, potíže s učením a jsme schopni efektivní.
Reflexes need to have time we get up onto 2 feet.
Takže primární reflexe se musí integrovat do doby, než se dostaneme do stoje.
And then the postural reflexes then help to carry us on through life.
A posturální reflexy nás poté provázejí celým životem.
Being able to have good muscle tone,
Mít zdravý svalový tonus,
being able to run hop,
že skákat.
but then when they come to sit still, if the areas of the brain are not well sufficiently connected, then that's when difficulties can occur.
Děti stále pobíhají kolem, hýbou se hodně, ale když mají sedět.
And these primitive and postural reflexes need to have played their role by about the age of 4 to 5 years old.
Tyto primární a posturální reflexy musí sehrát svou roli do věku 4-5 let.
So any retained reflexes past about 5, that's when there are going to be more learning difficulties that are then picked up, because that's the time when they go to school.
Takže když jsou nějaké reflexy přetrvávají po 5. roce věku, mohou vzniknout problémy s učením. Ve škole se to potom pozná.
Emotional issues, social issues, behavioral issues.
Emoční problémy, problémy společenské, problémy s chováním.
So again, learning to make these movements help to make the areas of the brain better connected, that those difficulties then are no longer a problem.
Že pokud vykonáváme tyto pohyby, ale nezapojíme
As you can see there, I'll just give you a minute to read through those.
vidíte roli, aby si to mohli pročíst.
Without movement, these issues, the mental stages don't sufficiently.
A bez pohybu tyto vývojové fáze neproběhnou dostatečně.
So these are the senses that need to be sufficiently developed to be able to learn and to be able to perform well in life, generally.
Toto jsou smysly, které potřebujeme.
So visual sense, being able to have two eyes working together,
Schopnost spolupráce obou očí.
visual again, accommodation, reading near to looking far, copying from the whiteboard to come back again.
Akomodace, čtení na blízku, vidění na dálku, opisování z tabule.
So slow copying skills from the board are a typical sign that accommodation and vision is poor.
A špatné nebo pomalé opisování z tabule je tedy akomodace.
Eye tracking, simple little tests of being able to go across like this, which we need to be able to do to read. Children cannot always do this that have difficulties, they're like this.
Je proto tento jednoduchý test a
Or
spousta
up.
dětí má potíže se sledováním očima a poté se čtení textu na stránce.
Or they'll be like,
Často sledují ne očima, ale celou hlavou.
we need to be able to cross the midline when we read a sentence right across a page.
Musíme vidět přepisu stránky, abychom mohli číst text, abychom byli schopni číst text.
We need the auditory area of the brain, the temporal lobe, for listening, for memory, for processing sound.
Potřebujeme temporální hlavky mozku pro vlastně sluch, pro zpracování zvuku, pro poslech, pro paměť.
Tactile sense is really important when we're on the floor because we have a larger body surface area.
Taktilní cítí je velmi důležité, když jsme na podlaze, protože máme vlastně dotýkáme se tělem velkého povrchu.
To stand on one leg.
Vestibulární systém, schopnost stát na jedné noze.
So children, you know, when you ask them if they'll stand on one leg, can they do it? Can they do it with their eyes closed, or are they wobbling, or I've got to have my arms?
Když se zeptáte dětí, aby stály na jedné noze, tak často s tím mají ztrácejí rovnováhu, nemohou stát na jedné noze se zavřenýma očima.
Vestibular is to do with the eyes and the ears
Vestibulár je spojen i s očima a ušima
and muscle tone.
a s polem tonem.
We've got the gross movement, how we hold a pen,
Poté zde máme hrubou motoriku,
The
a
time.
hrubou a jemnou motoriku, jak držíme tělo, jak držíme pero,
the type of pen grip,
styl toho pera,
how hard we press down on paper when we write,
jak moc tlačíme na papír, když píšeme.
all these, throwing a ball,
Obecně.
in space.
Kde se na tělo nachází v prostoru.
Some children have bodies, they don't know where their eyes, their ears are, they don't know where their arm is.
Některé děti nevědí, vůbec nemají povědomí o svém tělu v prostoru, neví, kde mají oči, uši, kde mají v jakém
Looking at the movement or the adult.
jak se sledovat
So if any of these senses are not sufficiently developed, then we're going to have learning difficulties.
A pokud některý z těchto smyslů není dostatečně vyvinutý, potom máme potíže s učením.
It's then just finding which of the reflexes that relate to these senses and then use movement to integrate them.
Musíme zjistit, které reflexy jsou spojeny s těmito potížemi a poté použít pohyby, které mohou umět.
Okay, so these are the stages of development that are really important for every child to experience in the first 12 months.
Toto jsou velmi důležitá stádia vývoje dítěte, kterými si musí každé dítě projít.
Time on our back. We need to learn to lift our head to build muscle tone.
Takže lež na zádech, musíme vlastně naučit se zvedat hlavu a začít budovat svalový tonus.
We need to be able to move our arms and legs
Musíme být rukama nohama,
rather than perhaps being swaddled.
lepší spíše než být v zavinovačce.
Left in car seats.
Nebo příliš často v autosedačce.
To move freely.
Děti musí být schopné pohybovat se volně.
Tummy time is really important to again be able to lift the head so it develops vision.
Velmi důležitý je poloha na bříšku, aby se dítě naučilo zvednout hlavu a tím začalo vyvíjet zrak.
Develop the core muscles.
Vyvinout svaly středu těla.
And to be able to learn to do the pre-crawl, so on their tummy, the commando crawl.
Aby se naučili, aby se připravili na lezení, naučili pohyby přípravy na lezení.
Okay, to then the baby starts to learn where the hands and their feet are, so they suck their toes and suck their fingers and bring things to the mouth, to the midline, which are all important to that midline, recognizing where it is.
Poté se děti učí ovládat své ruce, nohy, strkají si prsty do pusy, prsty na rukách, na nohách, přinášejí předměty do úst, přinášejí k středové ose těla a naučí se tím pádem získají povědomí o středové ose těla.
The baby needs to be able to learn to roll over from its back to its front and back again.
Dítě se potřebuje naučit převrátit se z bříška na záda a zpátky.
And then the baby needs to be able to learn to get up onto its hands and knees.
A dítě se potom potřebuje naučit, jak se dostat na všechny čtyři.
And if we see the baby struggling, some parents will go to help it.
Když vidíme, že naše dítě má potíže nebo vyvíjí velké úsilí, někteří rodiče přijdou a snaží se mu pomoci.
So it doesn't naturally learn to be able to learn how to do that itself, which eventually we'll be able to do.
Takže se dítě nenaučí, jak to udělat samo, ten pohyb, což by se později samo naučilo, kdyby mu rodiče nepomohli.
And that affects one of the reflexes that's called the STNR, the symmetrical tonic neck reflex.
Což má vliv na jeden z reflexů, který nazýváme symetrický tonický šíjový reflex.
Some babies don't get the opportunity to crawl on hands and knees.
Některé děti nedostanou příležitost k tomu, aby lezly po čtyřech.
And the crawling stage on hands and knees, before we get up onto 2 feet, develops the corpus callosum.
Období lezení se vyvíjí corpus callosum.
We have the two sides of the brain, and in the middle that joins the two are the fibers. And this is when the baby crawls on its hands and knees, it myelinates the corpus callosum.
Máme vlastně dvě mozkové hemisféry a mezi nimi je umístěno corpus callosum, které jehož nervové spoje se myelinizují, když je dítě leze po čtyřech.
So if a baby misses the crawling on hands and knees stage and is a bottom shuffler,
Pokud dítě neleze po čtyřech, často se posunuje po zadečku,
then those connections between the two sides of the brain don't get made sufficiently.
poté se nedostatečně vytvoří spojení mezi mozkovými hemisférami.
So then the information from the various sides of the body, the eyes, the ears, don't get to the opposite side of the brain sufficiently or quickly enough.
Poté se informace, které jsou po stranách těla, vlastně nedostanou dostatečně efektivně.
Is a really important stage to encourage every baby to go through, even if it's difficult for them to start.
Lezení po čtyřech je velice důležitá vývojová fáze, ve které bychom měli každé dítě podporovat, aby si ji prošlo.
The primitive reflexes need to have played their role sufficiently by the time we get to this stage. They need to have all integrated by this stage.
Takže primární reflexy musí sehrát svou roli před tím, než se dostaneme do stoje, než se dostaneme na dvě nohy a musí být do té doby integrovány.
Okay. So, if the primitive reflexes are still active by the time the baby gets up onto 2 feet, then those reflexes will remain at that immature level and still active, which will then hinder learning. So these are pictures of a typical baby and an atypical baby. So here he's testing for whether the baby is able to lift its head and the back remains straight, which is a good sign. This is what we look for. And then this is a baby that doesn't have good muscle tone and isn't able to support its back or its head and neck. So this baby is going to have a lot of difficulties if it can't sit, can't support, hasn't got good muscle tone. So sitting up at a table as you are here, it will find it very difficult. They're okay when they're running around and moving. And then when you sit still, I can't keep myself upright. Yeah. It's okay when they're moving around. It's a different type of movement. So much then, but when we sit, then it is. So this is when tummy time and back time help to develop the muscle tone of the back and the head and the neck, as well as developing vision and fine and gross motor movement. And then the baby is eventually, when given enough time doing this movement, can then release the arms and the hands, and I can still keep myself, my chest and my head up off the floor. So now, things up and bring them to my mouth. Developing the grasp, hands pulling reflex, midline, coming to the midline. Okay. So what can cause the reflexes to be retained? Okay, so we've got genetic inherited weaknesses from parents, grandparents. Mother was ill, didn't or couldn't move much. So if mother is, then obviously the baby doesn't get the movement from the mother's movement. And that then causes a delay in the development of certain reflexes. They may have drank, took drugs, smoked. So whatever mother has in the way of ingesting will go through the bloodstream into the baby. Is there any stress or shock to the mother while the mother was carrying the baby, particularly in the first 3 months? There's a reflex called the fear paralysis reflex. where it starts to emerge around 5 weeks after conception.
Který se objevuje již 5 týdnů po oplodnění.
And it develops and integrates while in the womb by about 3 months.
A vyvíjí se a integruje v děloze asi do 3 měsíců po početí.
If there's any major stress that happened to mum during that time,
A pokud matka zažije nějaký zásadní stres,
it can cause the fear paralysis to not become integrated.
a může to způsobit, že fear paralysis reflexe neintegruje.
And then the baby can be born with the fear paralysis still active in the system, which then can be carried on throughout life.
A potom si dítě může narodit s aktivním fear paralysis reflexem, který může přetrvávat po celý jeho život.
The fear paralysis affects the Moro reflex, which is the second reflex to develop in utero.
Fear paralysis reflex ovlivňuje Moro reflex, což je druhý reflex, který se vyvíjí v děloze.
So it's good to know, when I work with children, I like to ask parents with the questionnaire, were there any problems during pregnancy?
Takže je dobré, já se tady rodičů ptám pomocí dotazníků, zda matka zažila nějaký stres v těhotenství.
Then that gives me an indication of what reflexes still may be retained and why.
To mi dává jakýsi ukazatel na to, jaké reflexy mohou být stále, jaké reflexy mohou stále přetrvávat a proč.
Okay, so premature birth,
Předčasné narození může být problém.
baby's put in an incubator, doesn't get any movement, not much touch.
Děti, které jsou v inkubátoru po narození, nemají moc pohybu a moc doteku.
It delays development.
To zpožďuje vývoj.
Cesarean birth,
Císařský řez.
the baby, it doesn't come through the natural birthing canal that stimulates 3 or 4 reflexes during that short period or long period of time.
Dítě neprochází přirozeným porodním kanálem, který stimuluje 3 až 4 reflexy.
Problems with birth,
Problémy při porodu.
baby ill or the infant ill after birth,
Dítě je nemocné po porodu.
reoccurring infections, abused, abandoned, neglected.
Infekce, zneužívání, opuštění, zanedbávání.
All these will cause the reflexes to still be retained.
Všechno tohle způsobí, že reflexe stále přetrvávají.
Left to cry for long periods of time is a good one.
Když necháme dítě plakat po dlouhé časové úseky.
Particularly during the first 3 months after birth, 3-4 months after birth.
Zejména první 3 až 4 měsíce po narození.
That affects the Moro reflex, and the Moro is our fight or flight reflex, our safety, our survival reflex.
To má vliv na mororeflex, což je reflex zajišťující reakci boj nebo útěk a reflex.
So all of these issues that would come up in a consultation
Takže všechny tyto potíže, které probereme při konzultaci,
will give me an indication of where we work with children and why they have the difficulties that perhaps they've presented to me.
mi ukáží, kde mám s dítětem pracovat a proč má ty potíže, které má.
And any of these difficulties that occur can be changed and improved.
Jakákoliv z těchto potíží, o kterých jsme se bavili, může být změněna, může být upravena.
So, these are the primitive reflexes at the base.
To nebylo možné přeložit, takže asi vám to budu překládat takhle z toho slajdu.
And
Dole máme...
Yep. No, I know you won't. No, quite, yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you.
Takže tady dole máme primární reflexy, posturální reflexy, jakýsi základ.
And at the top we've got reading, writing and maths, learning generally.
A nahoře máme čtení, psaní, matematiku, obecně učení.
So the role of the reflexes here, the postural and primitive and postural reflexes, have a role to play in filling these areas of development so that reading, writing and maths.
Takže tyto reflexy vlastně na spodu mají svou roli ve vyplnění všech těchto oblastí až nahoru směrem k učení.
So if there are problems with reading, writing and maths, then there will be areas of development that haven't taken place, which will then be due to the primitive and postural reflexes.
A bude to z důvodu toho, že jsou špatně vyvinuty nějaké oblasti, které vyvinuty by měly, a bude to z důvodu tady těchto reflexů. Budou toho příčinou.
Okay, so this one shows you the same plugs, reflexes at the bottom, reading, writing and maths.
Tady máte vlastně stejné schéma, dole jsou reflexy.
This is a well-developed individual.
Toto je dobře vyvinutý jedinec.
And when we come to knowledge and learning, teaching, we can see what will happen when we pour that into a well-developed child.
A když se dostaneme ke znalostem a učení, uvidíte, co se stane, když to dítě.
So we go to the next one. We can see what will happen if we focus on reading, writing and maths and the development of the child is not ready.
Uvidíte, co se stane, když se zaměřujeme na čtení, psaní a počítání, ale vývoj dítěte není dokončen.
Then learning is for some will be very difficult and for some almost impossible.
Poté bude učení pro některé příliš obtížné a pro některé to bude téměř nemožné.
So then we have to go back to the very foundations,
Takže poté musíme jít dolů úplně k základům,
work on those reflexes,
pracovat na těchto reflexech,
which then develop those skills, those senses, areas of the brain,
které poté vyvinou tyto dovednosti, smysly, oblasti mozku.
and then reading and writing and maths become natural and easy.
A poté čtení, psaní a počítání se stane přirozeným a snadným.
I think it's a really nice demonstration, nice thing to look at
Toto je velice
for the eyes.
pěkné znázornění, jak to vysvětlit.
So the primitive reflexes, if we've got problems further up in the academic and the executive functioning area, the prefrontal cortex, behavior and social issues, communication issues, sensory motor perception, any of these up here, any problems here, well, then we need to look back down to the primitive reflexes.
Pokud máme problémy v jakékoliv z těchto oblastí, které jsou v pyramidě více nahoře, vždycky se musíme vrátit dolů zpátky k primárním reflexům.
Finding which reflexes are still active in the system,
A potom musíme zjistit, které reflexy jsou stále aktivní v systému,
which are actually very easy to do when you know what you're looking for.
což je vlastně velice snadné, pokud víte, jak to zjistit.
And then you give movements, developmental movements,
A poté poskytnout nějaké pohyby, nějaké vývojové pohyby.
then full development takes place, the connections are made, and learning and life become easier.
A poté se vlastně vývoj dokončí a učení se stane snadným.
So these are common signs that one would see. This is the suck and root reflex.
To jsou běžné známky přetrvávajících reflexů, které můžeme vidět, hledací a sací reflex.
So children, teenagers, adults can still retain this reflex.
Takže někteří děti, malé děti, teenageři, dospělí mohou stále tento reflex mít aktivní.
And by making the movement of stroking the side of the mouth,
A když
face,
pohladíte vlastně
whichever,
líčko, tak stále jakoby pohybují.
we should be able to stroke the face of the person and there's no reaction at all.
Měli bychom být schopni pohladit líčko osoby a nemělo by to vyvolat žádnou reakci.
This one, whether they're writing or they're cutting with scissors, we see
Tento reflex, když píšeme nebo když stříhají nůžkami,
that's a sign then that they have a Babkin reflex.
a zároveň vidíme pohyb úst, je to znamení toho, že je aktivní Babkinův reflex,
Because the hand and the mouth are very much related to one another.
protože ruka a ústa jsou velice silně spojeny dohromady.
We've got the pencil grip,
Uchop, vlastně máme uchop pera,
the different type of pencil grip, how you hold a tool and fork, pencil.
různé druhy uchopů, jak vidíme tušku, nůž, vidličku.
Will then indicate that they have hand reflexes still active.
Mohou být ukazateli toho, že jsou stále aktivní reflexy ruky.
So handwriting and manipulating and working with your hands will be affected. Tension in your arms, your fingers.
Bude to mít vliv na psaní rukou, manipulaci s nějakými předměty, může být napětí před loktí.
People have to, after a little while, get cramp in their fingers and they have to put the pen down and shake their hand. This one's a typical one of an asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. He can't have the paper directly in front of him, he has to have it at a side. Because the ATNR reflex is about crossing the midline. And that should have integrated by about 6 months old. It's a typical one that's related to dyslexia. It's a major reflex. Then we've got the fear paralysis reflex. This is the one that should integrate in utero. Children that are too scared to let go of their parents. Don't like being by themselves, don't feel connected and safe in the world. This one is it's a lifelong reflex if it hasn't integrated, and can be quite debilitating, quite really stressful in life. It's our survival. We'll do whatever we need to do to be safe. And then we've got the tonic labyrinthine reflex. So again, I haven't got good muscle tone to my neck to be able to hold myself up. So that when they're sitting for a long period of time, this is then again when they go into this position. Causes hunched posture, which affects their breathing. And affects their concentration. And they get quickly. Then we have this is again the head proper. And what it relates to. Balance. So this is a typical one when you ask the person to stand on one leg. Are they able to do this with their eyes open, eyes closed? You've got the Babinski reflex. Toe walkers. When they walk, they tend to bounce or walk up on their toes. They hardly touch the floor. ADHD type people will have, you'll notice that they will be more bounce and they'll spend more time on their toes when they're walking. They'll have weak ankles, hip rotation. They'll wear their shoes out either on the inside or the outside as they walk. So children go through their shoes quite quickly, but if you look at the base of the shoe and then you see that there is more wear on the outside than the inside, it indicates that there's a Babinski reflex. Then we've got the spinal galant reflex. This is a really one that's usually still active in children. So children that are still wetting the bed past 5 years old. It's still active. Auditory processing. Can't sit still. Can't sit back in a chair because that contact with the back, it causes irritation. So they tend to sit forward on their seats.
Takže se snaží nahánět dopředu, když sedí.
And this is one of the typical reflexes also that ADHD, people with ADHD will have retained.
A jeden z typických reflexů, které přetrvává u lidí s ADHD.
Then we got an example of an STNR.
Dále toto je příklad STŠR, symetrický tonický šílový reflex.
This should have integrated by about 11 months old,
A ten by se měl integrovat do 11 měsíců věku.
and the child shouldn't be able to sit any longer in the W position.
A dítě by nemělo být schopno v tomto věku již sedět v téhle pozici dvojitého V.
So this one is a typical one when people have weak core muscles.
A to je typický reflex, kdy lidé mají slabé svaly středu těla.
Children that can't copy from the whiteboard
Ale děti, které nemůžou opisovat z tabule.
and have upper and lower body poor communication, poor coordination.
A mají špatnou komunikaci horní dolní části těla, špatnou koordinaci.
So swimmers, poor swimmers, people who don't like swimming, can't do breaststroke or the crawl.
Špatní plavci, lidé, kteří nemohou plavat prsa. A já si myslím, že jste měla dotaz. Sorry, there's a woman having a question.
Sure. Sorry, I missed.
Ještě jednou že po 11. měsíci už by neměli být schopné sedět v tom dvojitém V. It already said it was about W sitting. That after 11 months old they shouldn't
They shouldn't be able to do it.
Neměli po těch 11 měsíci by neměli být schopné sedět v tom dvojitém V.
The muscle tone has developed, so their legs can't go out to the side. Okay? So the Moro reflex is the only reflex that's responsible for 5 senses. All the other reflexes are usually related to one. This one is...
Moro reflex, o kterém budu mluvit, se většinou týká všech 5 smyslů a reflexy, které se volí do teď se většinou jednoho nebo dvou, ale tento se týká všech.
And the Moro reflex peaks at birth. It's what the midwives and the doctors look for when the baby's born.
Moro reflex vrcholí při narození, je to reflex, který sledují doktoři při narození.
It's our first breath of life when we're born.
Doprovází náš první životní nádech.
So when the baby's born, the doctor or the midwife will tilt the head back, and the baby will go,
Takže když se dítě narodí, tak jej doktor zakloní a dítě udělá ten pohyb, co udělal má.
Yeah, and this reflex should integrate by about 3 months, 4 months old at the most.
A tento reflex by se měl integrovat do 3 až 4 měsíců po narození.
So with young children that can still retain it, if you make them jump,
Takže u některých dětí a dospělých, kteří tento reflex přetrvává,
how much of a reaction do they get? Do they still get this movement?
díváte se na to, jako mají jump?
Yes.
Když chcete, aby skočili, díváte se, zda se vyskytne tato reakce.
Do the hands still come out? Do the head go back?
Jestli se ruce rozebírají a hlava se zaklání vzadu.
So this is responsible for movement. So if children are suddenly pushed,
Tento reflex když do dítěte náhle strčíme.
children that don't like roller coasters or large, big movements,
Děti, které nemají rády horské dráhy nebo nějaké náhle pohyby rychle.
touch, they don't like, they will avoid any contact
Nemají rádi dotyk, vyhýbají se.
because it triggers it. I don't like being touched. Some people just don't like their arm or the hand or coming in contact with somebody else.
Protože to u nich vyvolává
the visual and auditory.
Může to být i zrakové a sluchové podněty.
So bright lights, flashing lights
Jasná světla, blikající světla.
can trigger the moro. Loud noises, lorry going past, low-flying aircraft, road drill.
Hlasité zvuky, může to být nákladní auto, letadlo, toto všechno může vyvolat mororeflex.
Puts them into the fight or flight, puts them into that stress mode.
Způsobuje to u nich reakci boj nebo útěk a dostává je to do stresového režimu.
Balance problems. So again, children that are not able to balance, this could be the TLR reflex. It can also be to do with the moro.
Mají problémy s rovnováhou a pokud tyto problémy mají, tak se mohou vázat k TLR reflexu anebo právě k mororeflexu.
So when you trigger this reflex, you can either go into fight, I can stand my ground,
Takže když tento reflex vyvoláte, můžete jít do reakce boj.
I can speak my mind and be confident to be able to do it, be assertive.
Takže chci se za sebe postavit, chci říct, co mám na mysli, chci být asertivní.
Or I don't have the confidence to be able to do that, and all I need and want to do is to get away from the situation.
A nebo nemám sebevědomí na toto udělat a poté chci si ze situace utéct. Takže to je reakce utěku.
With all the reflexes, what we need to be able to do is to have the resources to be able to cope with situations.
A se všemi těmito reflexy, o kterých se bavíme, to, co potřebujeme mít, je mít zdroje k tomu, abychom se mohli se situacemi, se životními situacemi nějak vyrovnávat, nějak s nimi nakládat.
So if we are still reacting to situations,
Takže pokud stále reagujeme na situace,
then somewhere in the system we still have primitive reflexes still active.
poté v našem systému mohou být stále aktivní primární reflexy.
When the integration's taken place, the inhibition's taken place of the reflexes,
Když integrace a inhibice těchto reflexů, když nastane integrace a inhibice reflexů,
we have the resources to be able to cope with most situations.
máme zdroje na to, abychom se vyrovnali s mnoha situacemi, většinou situací.
Okay, so looking at symptoms. Oh, going back. Sorry, I've done one too many. I've been clicking buttons, haven't I? Okay, so when a child is stressed, when the moro reflex is still active and they live in a moro, with a moro,
Takže když je dítě ve stresu, mororeflex je stále aktivní a my s tímto mororeflexem žijí,
it's very difficult to expect a child or an adult to be able to learn.
nemůžeme od dítěte nebo od dospělého očekávat, aby byl schopný se učit.
Because they're too busy living in survival.
Protože žijí v režimu přežití.
So by integrating the moro reflex,
Takže integrací mororeflexu,
which can be done at any time with movement,
což může nastat kdykoliv díky těmto pohybům,
it allows the moro to become integrated and the fight or flight system to be well modulated.
umožňuje to integraci mororeflexu a modulaci reakce boj nebo
That we don't get so stressed so easily and so quickly and we're able to manage.
to lépe řídit.
So if the moro is still active, it can have an effect on any of these functions of the body.
Pokud je mororeflex stále aktivní, může mít vliv na
And today we see more and more allergies.
dnes vidíme stále více a více alergií.
If we look at the moro and see that the moro, whether it's active or not,
Když se podíváme na mororeflex, zda je aktivní či není,
and if it is still active, we integrate it,
a pokud je stále aktivní a integrujeme jej,
then allergies can improve, become less and less.
mohou se zlepšit alergie.
The immune system becomes stronger
Imunitní systém může být silnější,
because the moro reflex is activated and resides, should I say, it resides, lives in the limbic system, the yellow area of the brain that I showed you earlier.
protože mororeflex souvisí s limbickým systémem, s tou žlutou oblastí mozku, které jsme si říkali.
So when the moro is integrated, then we're less stressed. We cope with situations a lot easier.
Takže pokud je integrovaný, jsme méně ve stresu a daleko lépe se vyrovnáváme s různými situacemi.
Children who live with a moro in the classroom and then go home, they have to have a sleep as soon as they get home. Or maybe in school, they get very tired very quickly.
Děti, které chodí do školy, mají monoreflex aktivní, poté se dostanou domů a mohou mít nějaké they come home and
When they go to sleep, they need a sleep.
They need sleep. Přijdou domů a potřebují se vyspat, nebo někdy dokonce večí, že usínají, jsou velmi unavení.
Because their system's on alert all the time during the day.
Protože systém je stále ve střehu po celý den.
And it's very tiring having a morrow.
A je to velice unavné mít aktivní morrow.
So again, looking at the reflexes, you've got all the different symptoms.
Takže se podíváme na reflexy a na různé symptomy, které se k ním váží.
In class,
Které vidíme ve školách,
in therapy.
na terapii.
We go to the doctor for.
Se kterými chodíme k doktorovi.
So all of these can disappear as each of these reflexes are worked on and integrated. All these they disappear.
Takže tyto potíže mohou zmizet, když budeme pracovat na těchto jednotlivých reflexech. Vlastně zmizí.
So the different types of dyslexia.
Takže různé typy.
Some children will have visual difficulties. And sometimes a parent might think, or a teacher will say something to a child or to the adult and say, go and get your eyes tested.
Někdy rodiče nebo učitelé dítěte na něco ptají a pak se ho zeptají, už si nechal testovat oči.
And there actually isn't any eyes, they don't need glasses.
Poté tyto děti zřejmě potřebují behaviorálního optometristu.
Or they look for the primitive reflexes. Or they look for the reflex, ATNR, STNR. And have auditory phonological difficulties. Some children have both auditory and visual, so that makes it even more difficult to read and write. Some have motor challenges, gross or fine motor movement. And some may have speech and articulation challenges. So the information from the senses may not be able to reach areas of the brain for the brain to process what's going on. And it's also to do with the corpus callosum. Is that well developed to allow the messages to cross? So what we see through the right eye should go to the occipital, the visual area on the left. And what we see through the left should go around to the right. But if this is not developed sufficiently, then that information tends to stop. And then this area of the brain can't process what we see sufficiently. Or a lot more slowly. And one of the simple tests for the corpus callosum is to ask a child or to be able to do this. And if the corpus callosum isn't developed sufficiently, then you'll see this homilateral. My brain, this one's controlling this side, this one's controlling this side. But when I do two, it requires both sides of the brain to work together. So you get the child to do the movement slowly. Can they do it slowly? Because it's also to do with balance. And if they can't do the cross crawl, then it can be an indication that they may not have crawled on hands and knees either at all or for long enough.
Pokud toto neumí dělat, může to být znakem toho, že dostatečně, že nelazuje nebo nelazuje dostatečně dlouho.
So symptoms of difficulties when reading, they soon tire when reading. Letter and number reversals. Needs colored overlays or glasses. Anybody have those in the class? Yeah. It can be an indication of a moro reflex still active. I've worked with several children that have had that. They have colored glasses or they have colored overlay over what they read. And by working with the moro integration, they no longer need them. Vision, text becomes blurry or it jumps. Guesses at words and doesn't remember when they see them again. Holds the book close to the eye or covers one eye or one side slightly to avoid the other having to do any work. They rub their eyes soon after reading or they become tired. Mm-hmm. They get headaches over the forehead or the back of the head. They use a finger to follow words or they might miss sentences, miss one. Networks for reading. These areas in dark, in black, bold, are all areas of the brain that we need working together to be able to. So we need a well-linked up brain, a well-connected brain throughout the different areas. Because many areas of the brain are required when we come to reading. So this is typical lack of from somebody who is better connected, areas of the brain that light up when they read, to a dyslexic reader who has very few. And by working with the reflexes, you can make stronger connections. From this, you can, because you're working with the senses come up through the central nervous system, and they stimulate the various areas of the brain, helping to make more of those connections throughout the brain. But a lot of this development, a lot of these connections should have been already made and better connected while the baby and when the baby's on the floor and then up to about 4 years old. So these are the reflexes that are usually retained in dyslexia. We've got the AT and R, that's a very common one. The symmetrical tonic neck reflex. Hand reflexes, of which there are 3. The spinal galant reflex, of which there are 3. And the moro reflex. So if these are still active in the system, then reading and writing is going to be quite a difficult challenge for people that have been labeled with the term dyslexia.
Pokud jsou ty terapeuty stále aktivní, potom je čtení a psaní a může být problém.
I had, many years ago, I had a 46-year-old man
Před mnoha lety jsem měl muže, 46letého muže,
who came to me because he couldn't read.
který přišel, protože neuměl číst.
He'd got children,
Měl děti
and he wasn't able to, he was too embarrassed to read to the children because it was like he was just beginning.
a bylo mu trapné číst těm dětem, protože četl, jak kdyby právě začal.
That he couldn't do is one of the things that I asked him if he was to do the cross call.
Jednou z věcí, které neuměl, byl tady ten pohyb.
And he couldn't do it. He had to look down, he had to think,
Musel myslet,
he had to process. You could see he was processing. How am I going to get this to work?
jak to bude dělat,
And immediately he would go into the homolateral crawl, one-sided.
a potom to dělal jednostranně, ten pohyb.
So that shows then the corpus callosum's not working.
Což ukazovalo, že jeho korpus callosum
So reading is going to be impossible,
a čtení bude nemožné,
as it proved to be for him.
což se mu stalo.
So I worked with him using movement only.
Takže pracoval jsem s ním jenom za pomocí pohybu.
It took about 50 minutes,
Trvalo to 50 minut asi.
and at the end of the session, he could cross-crawl.
A na konci sezení
When I saw him 3 weeks later, because I gave him the movements that he needed to go home to do,
když jsem ho viděl za 3 týdny, protože jsem mu dal nějaké pohyby, které měl dělat doma,
he had no problem with reading.
neměl problém se čtením.
His wife came with me and said, "How did you do that?"
Jeho manželka přišla a byla z toho vyjevená, jak se to zvládl.
And of course, being a 46-year-old man,
A samozřejmě mít 46 let,
how much of an effect that will have had on his adult life and choice of jobs.
jaký to mělo vliv na celý jeho život, na výběr povolání.
So this is one of the things that I particularly love about this work is that it's very simple.
Takže to je jedna z věcí, které na této práci mám velmi rád.
It,
Je
re-
jednoduchá,
it requires movement.
vyžaduje pohyb.
It doesn't require reading and writing and lots of practice that we
Nevyžaduje
give children.
čtení, psaní, hodně procvičování.
But it's movement, developmental movements that they need to be able to learn to make exactly.
Ale je zapotřebí naučit se pohyb vykonávat přesně.
That they should have done by 4 years old.
Což měli udělat třeba.
And because it's so simple,
A protože je to tak jednoduché,
people can't believe that movement is so important and can make such changes.
lidé nevěří, že pohyb je tak důležitý a že může učinit takového změny.
Doesn't know how to
Čísla,
poor hand pencil grip,
špatný uchop pera,
presses.
když tlačí na
Typical one with dyslexia, can't get my ideas on paper. I've got it all in here, but I can't get it down on paper.
nemůžou dostat své nápady na papír.
Yeah, that's a typical sign of an ATNR, asymmetrical tonic neck reflex.
To je typický znak asymetrického tonického šíjového reflexu, že se neumí vyjádřit na papír.
So all of these symptoms, difficulties that a child or an adult can have,
Všechny z těchto potíží, které dítě nebo dospělí mohou mít,
can again disappear with using developmental movements.
mohou vymizet za použití pohybových pohybů.
So this is a client I had 10-year-old many years ago,
Toto je klient, kterého jsem měl před mnoha lety, bylo mu 10 let.
and this was over a summer holiday. This was a before,
To bylo přes letní prázdniny.
and I didn't ask him to write anything. This actually was sent from the teacher from before a summer holiday.
Přišel, poslal ho učitel před letními prázdninami.
I saw him once,
Viděl jsem ho jednou
and I gave him 10 minutes of movements to do at home for 4 weeks.
a zadal jsem
And when he went back to school, this was the change.
Tak když přišel zpátky do školy, tak se změnil jeho rukopis.
I worked the vision and the hand reflexes.
Pracoval jsem na zraku a na reflexech ruky.
And it was just through movement. No reading, no writing practice over the holiday.
Bylo to jenom díky pohybu, nezadával jsem žádné psání během práce.
We just focus on movements and getting the movements exact and rhythmical and right. And the teacher couldn't believe the change and sent this to the parent, who then gave, which is a nice example to have.
A učitel nemohl uvěřit té změně, která se stala. To je vlastně, to dali rodiče toho dítěte, dali Markovi výsledek.
So what can be done to help make a difference to development and the ability to learn confidently? What have you gathered from what I've been talking about? What's important? Movement. Yeah. Training program uses development to mimic the movements that the baby naturally and infant should have learned to have made. So if the child or the adult, because this is adults as well, they can't do these specific type movements that I give through the rhythmic movement training program, then that's why they have the difficulties. So when they learn to make the movements rhythmical and exact, the reflexes become integrated, the senses become stronger, and the connections are made in the brain. So this is why movement is so important. Because it's the only way the brain will develop in the early years. So how do we do this? We observe and notice when you are and you know what to look for. You can then see them. And you never look at the same a person again the same way. See the signs of reflexes as well when they're walking in the street, sitting. But it's even clearer when you see them in the classroom, when children are in the classroom or the playground. So there are simple tests, physical tests that you can do with children. So these you, and I think it's a good to assess a child. Because if you test for the reflexes to begin with, you can see where the difficulties are going to be. And then by using movement, those difficulties will slowly ease away. And the children will be able to feel much more confident and able in learning. So by doing these little simple tests that you can do on a physical level, and you know the reflexes, then you know what you're looking for. So you can then test, or you can test for reflexes, do the physical test. And then when you know which movements go with the reflexes, you can give the child these movements to do. And it requires just 10 minutes a day, 10, maximum 15, no more. Some programs, they're expected an hour, sometimes hour and a half, 2 hours.
Některé programy vyžadují hodinu, některé hodinu až 2 hodiny.
But these movements of just concentrating on working and getting them right for 10 to 15 minutes a day, and to begin with, it's not as long as that.
Ale tyto pohyby vyžadují, abychom se nesoustředili pouze 10 až 15 minut denně.
With them practicing on a daily basis,
Procvičovat je denně,
until the movement becomes exact,
dokud se pohyb nestane přesným,
then the reflex is integrated.
a poté je reflex integrovaný.
The sense is developed,
Smysly jsou přinuté
and the area of the brain better linked, better connected.
a oblast mozku je.
And this, depending on the level of development of the child, can either take between 6 and 12 months,
To může zabrat 6 až 12 měsíců.
and with more severe difficulties, then it can take a little longer. It can take 12 to 18 months.
Při závažnějších potížích to může trvat trochu déle, rok až rok a půl.
And the program does require perseverance.
Program vyžaduje vytrvalost,
So I encourage parents to see their child improve, then work with them, and 10 minutes a day is not too difficult to fit in.
takže doporučuji rodičům, aby protože 10 minut denně není dlouho čas.
Okay, so these are some of the movements that I give to the children. There are a number more of them, but these are basic movements to do, very simple.
Toto jsou některé pohyby, které dávám dětem. Je jich více, ale toto jsou základní, které používám.
This set of movements requires a second person to work on the individual,
Tato sada pohybů vyžaduje další osobu, která pracuje s klientem.
and these movements have a very calming effect
A tyto pohyby mají velice uklidňující
on the mind, the body, the senses.
na psychiku, na tělo, na smysly.
And then after using these movements for usually about 4 weeks,
A potom, kdy používáme tyto pohyby, obvykle po dobu 4 týdnů,
then we go on to working with the active movements where they have to learn to be able to do them themselves. They look very simple,
poté přistoupíme k aktivním pohybům, které už dítě vykonává samo. Vypadají velice jednoduše,
but when you've got active reflexes,
ale když máte aktivní reflexy,
then some of these movements can prove very difficult, if not impossible for some.
to potíží velice obtížné.
So as they learn to make these movements exact,
Takže jak se učí vykonávat tyto pohyby přesně,
then the sense gets the development it needs.
dostávají smysly ten vývoj, nebo smysly se vyvíjí tak, jak potřebují.
So what we're going to do is I'm going to demonstrate, or get somebody to demonstrate these movements, just a few of them.
Takže co uděláme? Na někom ukázat tyto pohyby, a na nějaké dobrovolné.
Okay. So, if we go to the next one, please. So how do we apply rhythmic movements? So a trained person will be able to test for reflexes
Takže jak používáme rytmické pohyby, školená osoba bude schopná otestovat reflexy
and show the movements that the person needs to do at home or in school.
a ukázat pohyby, které má ten člověk vykonávat ve škole nebo doma.
So you learn the techniques and movements from attending a course.
Naučíte se techniky a pohyby díky absolvování kurzu.
And one of the good things about this program is there's no equipment other than perhaps a mat and a pillow to work with on the floor.
Jedno z pozitiv tohoto programu je, že nepotřebuje žádné vybavení, potřebujete jenom podložku, polštáře, které položíte na zem.
The movements are done on the floor rather than anything else because there's no movement from anything else and we go back to where the beginning.
Pohyby se vykonávají na podlaze, spíše než na nějakém jiném podkladu, protože se vracíme zpátky tam, kde jsme ty pohyby vykonávali a nebude se pod námi nic další.
And it's also an opportunity for parents to give their children one-to-one time.
Je to také příležitost pro rodiče strávit s tím dítětem čas.
10 to 15 minutes a day. Children like who wife the floor. So I encourage to do the movements as well because it encourages the child to do it, and also the child laughs at the parent when they can't do the movement either. And we're never too old to benefit from movement. So this is a school, two teachers that came on a course in the UK that took the movement straight back into the class or school. And I went along because this was in between levels that I was teaching. And they wanted me to see what they'd implemented in the school, what they brought, how they'd started it in the school. So they took one class out for 15 minutes every day. And they just did the movements for the period of time. Somebody rang the bell, they'd move on to the next movement. And the changes that the teacher had seen, this is a head teacher of the school, this is her special needs teacher. They found that the children settled, they liked the movements and they settled in their class very quickly. Okay, so some teachers say I don't movements. Actually, how much time does it take to try and teach a child who just doesn't get it? So by just giving them some movements a day, 10-15 minutes of movement a day, makes a level of change as soon as you made the movement, and then each day they do it, the movement just gets stronger and stronger and holds. And it just saves a lot of time and frustration for the teacher and for the child. Okay, so overall results, there's more efficient connections in the brain to have the resources to be able to learn. Teachers and parents have simple and natural, enjoyable techniques to help reach and improve anyone struggling with learning, anyone. So all these improvements you can get from making these movements. Okay, so have you got time for a demonstration? All right, for time? Okay, so this is an area of this is the cerebellum that develops, as I've said, between 6 and 12 months, or should. And it's a really important area of the brain to make the connections through to the frontal lobes. And the two speech areas. And the cerebellum's role is to make the movements smooth and rhythmical and automatic. So if people are having to still think about movement, then the cerebellum isn't developed as well as it could. So it develops eye tracking skills, stimulates working memory,
Stimuluje pracovní paměť
and comprehension skills just suddenly take off.
a schopnost porozumění.
And it's the neural network, it's part of the major part of the neural network for reading.
A je to součástí nervové sítě, která je potřebná k čtení.
Okay, so is there somebody that has difficulties with rhythm, coordination,
Potíže s rytmem a s koordinací?
mind, demonstrating,
Komu nevadí?
and having a go with the movements?
Tady jsou studentky z fyzioterapie, aby byla ráda, kdybyste některá vyzkoušela i na sebe motorní pohodlí. Tak jestli vás děvčata nějakou můžu poprosit. Physiotherapy.
Ah, okay. She should be good then. Hi, thank you. So, the cerebellum, one of the things that we do with the cerebellum
Jedna z věcí, které děláme pro testování mozečku,
is to ask the person to walk.
požádáme o
So-
osobu, aby se prošla.
If it's okay, if you want to start over here and have a good long walk. And what we do as a therapist is we observe the movement and just notice. Don't be, you relax.
To, co děláme jako terapeuti, jenom pozorujeme pohyb a zaznamenáváme, jak člověk chodí.
That's good. Yeah.
To je dobře.
Okay, and you ask the person to notice how it feels. Does it feel smooth, easy, effort?
Požádáte tu osobu o to, aby vám řekla, jaké to je, jak se přitom cítí. Jestli to je bez nějakého úsilí, jestli je to plynulá ten pohyb.
And if you stop, that's it. Now I want you, if you go back to there again, and I want you to walk backwards. Okay?
Požádáte člověka, aby šel pospátku.
And turn around. Good, stop. Now I want you to go sideways.
A teďka chci, aby šla do strany. Jakýmkoliv způsobem.
Looks quite good. Looks good. Thank you. Stop. Okay. Did it require much thinking?
Vyžadoval to hodně přemýšlení?
No, it didn't look it. It looked good.
Vypadalo to dobře.
Does anybody else have difficulties? We'll try another one. Now, tap a rhythm.
Vyťukat rytmus.
Any rhythm you like. Just tap a rhythm. Keep going.
The same one?
Anything you like. And the reason why you keep it going for a little while is that people learn to compensate.
Rytmus nechali vyťukávat delší dobu, protože lidé se naučí kompenzovat.
So do it, the compensations then start to wear out and you see really what.
Ale necháte to dělat, tak ty kompenzace jakoby ustupují a vy můžete vidět, co je tím původním problémem.
How did that feel to do that rhythm? Keep it going.
Jaké to bylo? Jak jste se přitom cítila?
Nevěděla jsem, jak dlouho to robí, tak.
She didn't know how long to
Keep it going. Okay. So let's demonstrate the movement. With somebody that had a severe lack of development to the cerebellum, you would notice very clearly
U někoho, kdo má potíže, kdo nemá dobře vyvinutý ten mozeček, zaznamenali byste nějaké.
that the movements would be awkward,
Pohyby by byly zvláštní,
not rhythmical,
nerytmické,
not automatic.
neautomatické.
You could see the person would have to think about the movement.
Viděli byste, že ta
tapping the rhythm, they would lose the rhythm after a little while.
Po chvilce, při tom rytmu by po chvilce ztratili rytmus.
So let's just do, we'll do the movements, okay? And just notice afterwards. So if you will lie on your back on here. Okay, so I'm going to ask her to do these movements. These are movements that she needs to learn to do herself. Okay, so you can do them in any order. So this is called sliding on the back. And what we look for are movements to be able to be rhythmic and smooth. Okay, so if you lift and bend your knees. Okay. No, this and it would be we're going to start from here, and I'll start you off by making this. You just keep your feet here, and I'm going to start you off like this. Okay, now one of the things that we observe when we do the movements is how far up does the movement go? And what I'm observing here is that there are neck reflexes. Because what should happen is that the head should naturally move in time and flow with the body. So now I want you to do this movement yourself. Push with your feet and get that movement going. That's it. So I come out of your way so you can see. And I want you to nod your head in time with your body, so your chin. And you can see the head is a little bit more of a struggle. Sliding on the back is good. Okay, keep going a little bit more. And you'll find with the cerebellum, the movements will be really difficult, very awkward to do. Adults, children cannot get this movement going. There's just a little longer. Because what you do is you keep the child or the adult going for a little bit. Because the compensations then start to wear out, and then you start to really see again what's going on deeper. So this is what it should look like. This is good movement. The head, but it should be automatic. Are you having to think about the head movement? Yeah. The head would naturally go in time with the body rather than I'm having to make it. Okay, so that's on the back, but you get all sorts of movements. The bottom rises off the floor. There is no movement. And it does work the vestibular system because the head's moving. The tactile sense is being stimulated because of the amount of contact on the floor. And what we want from the cerebellum is rhythm. Because if one hasn't got rhythm in the body, then the cerebellum is undeveloped. And rhythm starts to come in from the jerky movements that the baby would now start off. And then between 6 and months, the cerebellum's role is to make those jerky movements smooth and rhythmical and automatic. So this one is called the windscreen wipers.
Tento pohyb se jmenuje stěrače.
The heels are about 4 inches apart. Yeah, I don't know, I'm not centimeters. Fist, about a fist width. Fist width apart, yeah.
4 palce, ale...
And the movement is out to the side. Now I use a metronome, or you can go tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock. You can download it from the internet. And then you see whether the person can make the movement smooth and rhythmical and equal on both sides. And the movement needs to come all the way up to the hips. So it's not floppy ankles, it's to do with leg movement. This is also stimulating 2 sides of the brain. We're getting rhythm into the body gradually. So if this one is a difficult one to do, then I would put my hands to the sides. And then you start the movements and touch my hand. So this would be difficult for somebody with STNR because they don't know what's going on below their waist. STNR. So what we're looking for is that rhythm and symmetry. Okay, so to begin with, that one can be really difficult to do for some when the cerebellum isn't functioning. Okay, so then we'll do, if you'll turn over onto your front, please, and place your hand on your forehead. That's it. One of the things that we do as a therapist with rhythmic movements is that we observe the body. Because when they're lying on their back or they're lying on their front, you can sometimes, when you know what you're looking for, look for tensions, stress tension, muscle tension, and possible reflexes. There's a big gap here between the front of the calves and which indicates there's tightness in the legs. Okay, so we put a pillow under the ankles. No, not because of the gap, to isolate the legs. Okay, so if it's okay, if you could ask, can I hold the top of the trousers? I always ask that because if you've got a tactile, sensitive person, they won't like that. Me go straight in. So always let the person know what you're doing. This area of the body relates to the limbic system. The yellow area on the triune brain that relates to emotions. So if somebody is very uptight and very emotional, if I just grab here, you send them into the morrow. Okay, so I'm going to start the movement off. I just hold here and I just roll. And now I want you to continue making that movement. Okay? So you start them off, show them what you want them to do. And what I don't want to see is her having to make the movements from the legs or from the shoulders. So anywhere from the blades up is wrong. But some people, that's the only way they can get the lower back to move, is that I've got other parts of the body involved.
aniž by se zapojovali do pohybu jiné části těla.
So I'm looking for symmetry.
Takže já se dívám na symetrii.
Is it equal on both sides?
Je to
Because
stejné na obou stranách.
if there's tension in the lower back, particularly on one side,
Protože pokud je napětí v bedrech, zejména na jedné straně,
it can indicate that there's a spinal gland reflex.
může to ukazovat na spinal column reflex.
And you get the person to do this for as long as they can towards the 90 seconds.
A necháte toho člověka, aby to dělal tak dlouho, jak může, a
Making sure that they're not using their arms and shoulders to get that area.
používají tu oblast ramen a paže.
Okay? So movements are but not easy to do.
Pohyby jsou velice jednoduché, ale
There are reflexes that are still active.
pokud jsou zde
There's coordination,
nedostatečná koordinace
lack of symmetry.
a nedostatečná symetrie.
So gradually these movements need to be made. And these movements are exactly what you would see a baby do, but obviously on a bigger scale.
Takže tyto pohyby by postupně mělo
Okay,
být možné
thank you.
vykonat a jsou to vlastně pohyby, které vidíte u malých dětí, že dělají.
Now, because this area relates to the limbic system, the emotional area of the brain,
Protože tato oblast se váže k limbickému systému, té emoční oblasti.
when you start to release any tightness and fixation that there may be in this area, muscle tightness,
Když začnete uvolňovat jakékoliv napětí a blokády v této oblasti
and there's emotion that's being stored in the body,
a jsou to nějaké emoce, které jsou uzavřeny v tom těle,
the emotion will come to the surface.
emoce
And that's a good thing,
a to je dobrá věc,
because it's helping the person to release what they're bottling up.
protože to pomáhá tomu člověku uvolnit to, co vlastně je.
But it needs managing, obviously, because you'll get anger,
Protože najednou se můžete rozplakat, můžete dostat vztek,
and sometimes they don't know where it's come from. They don't know it's there.
to přichází z lidí, že to
So these movements, as little as they may,
pohyby, i když jsou rozsahu,
can have a very powerful and beneficial effect on body and mind.
mohou mít velice silný a velice příznivý účinek na tělo i na uši.
So again, somebody who's got area here, this movement will be very difficult.
Takže pro někoho, kdo má velké napětí a stuhlou oblast beder, bude tento pohyb příliš náročný.
Whoop, mind the spatial awareness. Okay, so then we're going to do the last two movements at the bottom here.
Děláme dva poslední pohyby.
So I want you to bring, so I say to children, where are your ears? And if they know where their ears are,
Řeknu dětem, kde jsou tvé uši,
and then place them at the level of their, so down here, but don't rest on your elbows, just go back down. That's it. Okay. Spread your fingers, because then you are working the hand reflexes,
takže pracujete na reflexe ruky,
pressing the palms into the mat.
tlačíte dlaně do pokožky,
They come up onto their toes.
můžou zvednout si vlastně takhle nohy na prsty,
Lift the chest and head a little off the floor, but look down at the mat.
zvednete prsa a hlavu,
And then you pull with the hands and you push with the toes.
a poté taháte rukama a tlačíte nohama.
So you're getting head to toe rock, not a floor to ceiling.
Takže se houpáte od nohou k rukám, ne směrem nahoru ke stropu, ale směrem dopředu dozadu.
They're working the Babinski reflex.
Nohy pracují na babinského reflexu,
They're releasing tightness in the calves.
uvolní se napětí v plítkách,
They're helping their hand reflexes.
pomáhá to reflexu ruky
And they're building muscle tone to the upper arm and upper back.
a buduje se svalový tonus v horní části paží a v oblasti ramen.
And you ask the child or adult to do this for as long as they can and stop when they feel they've had enough.
A požádáte dítě nebo dospělého, aby ten pohyb dělali tak dlouho, jak můžou, a aby přestali, až budou mít dost.
Okay, so this is a good movement, but with some people whose cerebellum's not functioning and they have poor muscle tone,
To je dobrý pohyb pro někoho, jeho mozeček nefunguje a má špatný svalový tonus.
this can be really hard to do
Může být to velmi obtížné.
to begin with.
Začít s tím.
And then with practice it gets easier and easier, and usually within about 3 weeks
A s cvičením to dostalo snadněji a snadněji a obvykle do 3 týdnů.
they've got them rhythm. That's it. Okay, rest. Okay. So you do what they can to start with and build the time up to the 90 seconds over the 2 to 3 week period.
Takže děláte to, s čím mohou začít a snažíte se postupovat, až dosáhnete těch 90 vteřin.
But with some, they will only do it maybe for 10, 20 seconds, and that's as much as they can do.
Někdo to bude schopný dělat pouze 10 nebo 20 sekund a víc nezvládne.
Okay, so then the next and last one is the same movement, but this time lay your feet flat. That's it. So now the movement is just from the hands. Okay, so lift the chest again. And you make sure that the chest stays off the floor. Keep reminding them so that it's building muscle tone to the upper arms, upper back. Because this can be very tiring, and then it's not resting on the elbows, so you're making the so they're just soft. Okay, then you're not actually putting the full weight on them. Okay, that's it. So relax your legs and just pull with your hands. And you can see that one's a little bit more difficult. Yeah? Okay. So again, you say to the person, do what you can and stop when you feel that's enough. We can build the time up over time. So stop when you need. Okay. How does the movement feel?
I feel it in the arms.
In the arms, yeah. Uh-huh. When we look at the body and we know what we're looking for, we look for areas of tightness and tension. And you can see here, the keeping the body, the chest off the floor, requires muscle tone. So when the baby rolls over onto its front, it has to learn to lift its head. It's one of the most important things that the baby needs to learn is to separate the head from the body in time. Okay, thank you. So if you and walk again. Okay, now stop, turn around and walk backwards. Turn around. Okay, and then go sideways. And then back. Okay. And how did that feel compared with the first time?
Maybe I feel more tired.
More tired now? Because you've worked your body in a different way. Yeah. Now tap a rhythm. Whatever you like. Okay, and how does that feel from when you did that the first time?
It's not that rhythmical, or maybe
Not as rhythmical as the first time, as it was. When you start working with the body, you can cause a little bit of disorganization in the body. So some things can get worse before they get better. Which can be a good sign that what you've done has done some good. Some people go in from finding it difficult as a pre-movement.
Pro některé lidí je potom ten pohyb obtížnější než ty pohyby. Vlastně.
And then having made the movements, doing the post-movement is easier.
A je pro ně snazší udělat ty pohyby potom, po tom cvičení vlastně, ty zkoušky.
Some it causes disorganization.
U někoho to způsobí dezorganizaci toho systému.
So these movements would be good to do, particularly the hands, rocking on hands and toes, because it will help the muscle tone, it'll help your neck and your shoulders, help between the shoulder blades.
Takže pro vás by bylo dobré vykonávat ty pohyby, hlavně ten poslední, s pomocí rukou, protože to vlastně buduje svalový tonus v pažích a oblastí hramen.
Okay? So 10 minutes of those movements a day for about 3 weeks, if you want to. Okay? Thank you. Thank you. Okay, did anybody notice anything different about the movements before and after?
Všimli jste si někdo nějakého rozdílu v pohybech před cvičením a po? Walking was faster and more free. There wasn't as much rotation in pelvis.
Byla napřímenější a lepší spevněné břicho, bych řekla, jako laicky řečeno.
So there was a better tension in our belly, and the posture was like straight.
Yes, it's like a pulled up.
Lépe využívala ten chůzový mechanismus, že ohýbala jako kolena, přirozenější pohyb.
She bended knees while walking better than the beginning.
A lépe pracovala s
Chodidlo?
ano, jako, no, ale jako s klenbou. Nechodila napřímo, ale lépe jako vystahovala
She was better working with the arc.
Yeah. And the feet, the position of the feet on the floor. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Good. That's great. Great observation. So just of those few minutes of movement, a few seconds of movements on each of those has made a level of change.
Takže pouze pár vteřin pohybu, tohoto způsobu pohybu udělalo nějakou změnu.
So about 10 minutes of movements a day for about 3 weeks.
Takže 10 minut těchto pohybů denně po dobu 3 týdnů.
The change that takes place from what she's done now
Ta změna, která nastane od toho, co udělala.
will just build and build until it becomes automatic.
Bude stále se posilovat, až dokud se ten pohyb stane automaticky.
Any questions?
Máte nějaké otázky? Ano? What to do with a child which didn't go through terrible twos stage?
You would need to work one of the movements that you could do with the child is to do that rolling of the bottom. There are other movements, and one would need to really look at the reflexes and use the movements that develop. One of the important things to do is to do these movements in order, because you need the frontal lobes to be better connected.
Takže jedna z důležitých věcí je dělat ty pohyby to do the movement in order.
The movements in order, the reflexes in order, yeah, working the cerebellum. Because the cerebellum makes the connections to the frontal lobes that gives more control.
Dělat to v jistém pořadí, abyste vlastně zapojili správně ty oblasti mozku do té prefrontální kůry.
Because the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex need to be strongly linked.
Protože limbický systém a ta prefrontální kůra musí být silně spojeny.
For the management of emotions.
Pro řízení emocí.
This is why some children that are all over the place and out of control, ADHD, behavioral issues, lack the control from the frontal lobes.
Proto některé děti, které se jako velice projevují, pořád někde běhají, mají ADHD nebo problémy s chováním, tak jim chybí spojení do té prefrontální kůry.
Because the frontal lobes give you the most appropriate responses, and I know how to behave, when to behave. I know when to talk, when not to interrupt.
Protože čelní lalky vám dávají ty informace, jak se mám chovat, kdy se tak mám chovat, že nemám skákat do řeči a tak dále.
So those 6 months, between 6 months and 12 months after birth, when the cerebellum should make the connections, initial connections to the front brain,
Takže těch 6 měsíců, mezi těmi 6 až 12 měsíci po narození, ten mozeček má vytvořit spojení s těmi frontálními laloky.
brings a level of control.
Nám vlastně nastavuje jakousi úroveň řízení a kontroly.
Any other questions?
What to do when a 5-year-old child isn't able to stay on the forearm like this, to do this, to get up from the chest from the floor? What to do?
So
Neudrží se, can't.
they haven't the muscle tone.
Nemají svalový tonus.
So they start off from what they can do,
Začnete od toho, co mohou dělat.
and then gradually, if they have to rest their elbows to make the movement like this, that's okay to start with.
Zkusíte začít takhle.
And then they need to come off as they get better muscle tone. Then they can lift their elbows, make them light. So we don't want this movement. We want them like this to start with, and then they come up.
Standing or lying?
Sorry?
Like this standing?
No, lying down.
But he can manage.
He can't manage.
Like this.
So you can start them off like this,
Můžete začít takovým malinkým.
and then as they learn to get the movement, then the muscle tone will start to come. They can lift, and they can be like this. Okay,
He can
and
manage to do like three
yes,
movements like this.
that's fine, and then build,
Start
then
there.
build it up. So always start with the child.
Začnete s tím, co zvládne. Jo, na začátku.
Start from where they can to what they then should be able to do.
Začnete s tím, co mohou dělat,
And it just
a pokračujete dál.
and it takes time. But the practice comes, the muscle tone will get stronger. He will be able to have better muscle toned upper arms and neck and upper back.
Lepší svalový tonus, může jít dál.
Okay.
Na hlas my neslyšíme vůbec.
Aha. Si můžete hlasitěji ten
Že jsem slyšela některé z těch symptomů, že vlastně se shodují vlastně jako kdyby pro symptomy dětí s autismem, jako kdyby spas, jako Aspergerův syndrom a jiné, jako kdyby lehčí formy autismu. Jestli má jako kdyby zkušenosti s tím, jak i třeba ten autismus se dá jako kdyby zlepšit.
Yeah, the question was that the symptoms are connected with all the symptoms of the children with autism. So if you can experience, if you have a experience with these children with autism and how to improve their state.
By using the rhythmic movements, it will improve their development, stronger links in the brain, because children with autism usually have a smaller cerebellum.
Děti s autismem většinou mají menší mozeček, takže vlastně prostřednictvím těchto pohybů, které
Practicing the movement,
ten mozeček,
speech center comes better connected.
jsou lépe zapojená řečová centra.
The limbic system is stronger
limbický systém je
for emotions,
pro emoce
and then the frontal lobes for more control.
a ty vlastně čelní lóky potom mají více kontroly.
So it doesn't matter what condition the person has, what label they've been given.
A nezáleží na tom, v jakém stavu vlastně je to ten člověk, nebo jakou má nálepku, řekněme.
These movements should have been made when they were young,
Tyhle pohyby se vlastně to dítě mělo vykonávat v tom dětském věku.
but may have been missed for whatever reason.
A z jakéhokoliv důvodu mohly být vlastně vynechány.
But we still need to learn to make them, and as we make them, no matter what age we are, you still get that level of development.
Pořád se snažíme je vykonávat.
And the symptoms, the difficulties that people have with autism and Asperger's,
A ty symptomy a ty problémy, které děti s Aspergerovým syndromem nebo s autismem mají,
cerebral palsy, can be improved.
s mozkovou obrnou, tak se mohou zlepšit.
It can just take a little longer.
Jenom to zabere času.
Okay? These are only just 5 movements I've given. The chart before, there was a lot more, and they work on different areas of the brain and the different senses,
A pracují s různými oblastmi mozku a s různými smysly.
and they work on different areas of the body.
A pracují
Spine.
s různými oblastmi těla.
Hips, feet, neck, shoulders,
Páteří, boky, chodidly, rameny,
muscle tone,
ken, svalovým tónem,
back issues, scoliosis.
problémy se zády, skoliózou.
Okay? Good. Yeah?
Taková čistě jako nedůležitá, ale jako zajímavá věc. Dělali oni někdy nějaké studie, které by třeba mapovaly funkční jako změny v tom mozku před třeba po cvičení u těch dětí nebo u těch dětí s problémy?
Is there a research mapping the changes using this movement?
Yeah.
And or something like children with problems?
So if
Yes, there is. Yes.
if we go to the
Oh,
please, sorry.
to předposlední slide.
Yeah. Okay, so if you go to the www.rhythmicmovement.org resources,
Tyto adrese.
there are research that has been done with RMT.
Jsou výzkumy, které se s RMT prováděly.
Because having it peer-reviewed is expensive, so what you'll find are people that have done their own work, written their papers up, and
Protože ten výzkum je velice nákladný, tak tam najdete vlastně nějaké zprávy od lidí, kteří ty pohyby vykonávali. Jak je to jmenují?
these books are very good to read. Sally Goddard Blythe,
To knihy jsou velice dobré.
Attention, Balance and Coordination. It's a thick book. It's about this thick, and she's gone into the research in a really big, deep way.
A šla opravdu do hloubky.
She doesn't do rhythmic movements. They have a different method, and it takes a lot longer and is more difficult. Rhythmic movement training is the easiest.
Nedělala ten movement training, dělala jiné pohyby, daleko složitější. Rhythmic movement training je jednodušší.
Dr. Harold Bloomberg
Dr. Harold Bloomberg
wrote the book, The Rhythmic Movement Method,
napsal knihu.
talks about autism in there. Doesn't give you the movements, but it explains areas of the brain and the difficulties they can have.
Nedává tam jakože ty pohyby, ale vysvětluje vlastně mozku, kde se vyskytují.
Bonnie Brandes, A Symphony of Reflexes, is a very good book too. I don't know whether you can get it translated.
Taky dobrá kniha Symfonie reflexu. Bonnie Brandes.
But it gives you lots of examples and case studies that have been done.
Tam hodně příkladů a případových studií, které se provádějí.
Okay. Other questions? Well, you've done very well to sit through that.
Velice dobře jste tady seděli.
I wish we had a bit more time that you could actually each have a go at the movements. But you've got Gabriella and you've got Eva that have done the training with me and are going to do the training with me over the next 4 weeks, 4 days, 4 weeks.
Máte Evu a máte mě, které jsme už absolvovali školení u Marka a budeme mít vlastně další školení teďka 4 dny.
So Eva has done her case studies. I've got to read through those so that she will be a consultant in rhythmic movement training international.
Takže bude konzultantem v rhythmic movement training.
So you can come to her and learn the movements.
Za ním můžete přijít a naučit se movement.
That was me with Joe from Rochester.
Sorry?
That knows me from
Oh,
Rochester.
okay,
And,
okay. Okay, I didn't know that. Yeah, good, I didn't know that. Okay, well, thank you very much.